Hello, this is Dr. Feast Price, and for this portion of the lecture, I would like to talk with you about the group counselor and what is an effective group leader. Previously, we've talked about the personal characteristics of an effective group leader, and so I will not go through the personal characteristics with you again. However, I would like to encourage you to pay particular attention to all of the characteristics and attributes that are perceived to be most effective for an effective group leader. As you review the list, if you find that there are areas that you may be somewhat deficient or limited, think about ways in which you can enhance or positively impact your skills and abilities in those areas. I'd like to talk with you specifically about the group process, and it's influenced by the power of the leader. The group leader possesses a number of various kinds of power that are most important in the group context. And so I'd like to go through the list and then talk with you briefly about those leadership powers that are perceived to be the most effective among group members. First, there is expert power. And expert power is the knowledge and expertise that each group leader comes with in the therapeutic process. So, for example, if you're working with persons with substance abuse and chemical dependency, it's important that you understand all of the relevant information specific to the cycle of use, abuse, and dependency, as well as the relapse cycle. If you're working with persons with traumatic brain injury, it's important that you have an expansive knowledge base of traumatic brain injury. So you want to understand the parts of the brain that's impacted and what some of the residuals are in terms of one's functional ability for that particular area of brain injury. Or if a person has HIV and AIDS or AIDS, and you're working with a group of persons with HIV and AIDS, you want to understand some of the psychosocial issues associated with having the disease progression, the ways in which a person can prevent the disease, and societal issues associated with the disease. So when you have expert power, it means that you have the knowledge and expertise that's needed in order to effectively meet the needs of the group. If you're working with a group with anger management issues, you want to make sure you understand the different stages of anger management and how to assist persons with overcoming issues of anger management. That will ensure that you have the expert power needed in order to effectively meet the needs of the group. There's also referent power, and referent power is consistent with some of those attributes identified by Rogers, the ability to identify with and feel close to your participants. We've already talked about in the previous lecture that the effectiveness of the group has to do with the extent to which there is the therapeutic relationship. And so referent power pertains to the relationship part of what we do as group leaders. It pertains to our ability to have close relationships with our clients, our ability to put ourselves in the shoes of our group members and identify what their life experiences might have been like. Legitimate power is the power that exists among group leaders by virtue of the fact that you are the leader. You are the person that is the expert in the group. You have the ability in some instances to have people dismissed from a group. I know with the groups that I've worked with that are court mandated, with that legitimate power you have as a group leader, you have the ability to have the person put back in prison or put back in jail if you report certain things to their either the judge or their court official. So legitimate power is the power that is inherent in your role as the group leader. Reward power is your ability to reward and reinforce the group members. So, like for example, at the end of the group, if you have members that are there for anger management, and they need a certificate at the end of the group stating that they have successfully matriculated through the group, and they get this certificate, your ability to produce and provide that certificate is reflective of reward power. So within your capacity as the group leader, your ability to reward and reinforce behavior and participation is recognized as reward power. Coercive power is your ability to move or punish the group. So, depending on the kinds of groups that you're working with, you possess the ability to either punish or remove the members. I mentioned group members that might be there as a court mandate. So, if you have the coercive power, you have the ability to contact their parole officer, contact the judge, and have the person either punished, removed, or put in jail as a result of their performance. And so coercive power is consistent with your ability to do just that. Informational power has to do with your ability to provide group members with information about resources that exist within the community. Depending on the population you're working with, there are times when you have to identify community resources. For example, if the person is in need of housing issues, you might refer them to the housing authority where they can get subsidized housing, or other kinds of facilities where they might get food subsidies, or the food pantry, job placement skills, or temporary employment agencies. That's your ability to know what additional resources exist within the community and to refer your participants to community resources based upon their needs. Connection power exists when we as treatment providers work collaboratively with other treatment professionals. Nowadays, we don't work in a vacuum. We work with other kinds of treatment providers, whether it be job placement specialists or employment counselors. It might be working with judges or lawyers or social service agencies. Whatever the case might be, it's important to recognize that we have the connection power that goes with working with other professional experts, other service providers who can meet the needs of our group members, because we can't do it all. And so it's important that we have the collaborative relationships where information is shared so that we can work to the greatest benefit of those with whom we serve. The power that I believe to be most relevant in a group setting is expert power and referent power. Those two, you definitely have to have the knowledge base. You have to have an ability to develop relationships with the persons with whom you serve. And I also think informational power is very important depending upon the kinds of consumers that you work with. You want to be able to refer them for the treatment services they need when you cannot meet their particular service needs. The next form of power that I'd like for us to discuss is legitimate power. And legitimate power is the position of a group leader. So, for example, a policeman has legitimate power. They have the ability to arrest you, to interrogate you. So, with certain leaders, there is legitimate power. By virtue of the role and position that they hold, there is a legitimate level of power. So what kind of legitimate power exists among mental health professionals, among group leaders? Well, the fact that you are the group leader, you may be, for me, I'm Dr. Price in the groups. My groups see me as Dr. Price. I'm referred to as Dr. Price. or for those of you that will become licensed professional clinical counselors, or in whatever capacity you will work in, you are in a position of power. You are considered a leader by virtue of your status. And so it's important to recognize that you do have legitimate power as a mental health treatment provider. While you might have the legitimate power that goes along with your title, if you don't have referent power as well as expert power, then your ability to be effective, particularly in groups, will be very limited. And so when you have legitimate power alone without having referent power or expert power, you're pretty much perceived as a figurehead. However, you're not respected or acknowledged for your position. Reward power is the ability to reward and reinforce. So our employer has reward power because at the end of our work period, we are rewarded with a paycheck. And so that's reward power, when after you've committed a particular act, that you're rewarded for it. When I work with persons with substance abuse and chemical dependency, I am in a position of reward power because by the time they finish, they get some kind of reward or certificate. That means that they have successfully completed the program. As such, they may have shorter jail sentences. They might be meeting a court mandate. And so the reward power depends on some of the groups for which you might be working with. I know also with reward power, every month with persons with substance abuse, chemical dependency, anger management groups, I have to complete a monthly evaluation that communicates how well a person is doing, the extent to which they're participating and attending. And so those evaluations are tied with a certain level of reward. As such, depending on the group that you're working with, you may have reward power, but it really depends on the group and whether the reward is intrinsic or whether it's extrinsic. So some other entity will receive this certificate of completion, which gives the group member a certain level of reward or reinforcement. So reward power is something that we often provide, and it is dependent on both intrinsic as well as extrinsic kinds of reinforcers. Coercive power is the ability to move or punish the group. So depending on the group, if you expel a group member from the group, then it can have consequences, especially if the person is in the group based on court mandate. So your ability to have coercive power also ties into whether or not you have reward power. If you have the ability to reward, especially extrinsic rewards, which are tied to court mandated attendance of groups, you also have the coercive power because you can punish groups or group members. You can expel them from the group, or you can turn in negative evaluations of their participation. So basically, coercive power has to do with extrinsic agents that require information or even mandate information for group participation. Informational power, information about members or resources. Depending on the kinds of groups you're working with, there are times when you have to know what resources exist within the community. So if you have group members that might be going through grief or bereavement, or they might have substance abuse issues, you might have to refer them to other treatment providers. If there are issues with food or housing issues, sometimes you have to refer them to agencies that could meet those needs. In my capacity in working with persons that are in recovery, substance abuse and chemical dependency recovery, as a result of their drug use and abuse and dependence, sometimes there are issues related to employment or housing or proper nutrition. And I am always obtaining information about job leads, especially if they are unemployed, and oftentimes they have felony records. And so whenever I hear of employment opportunities that are felon-proof jobs, I always refer persons to those jobs, because I know that the resources are very important and needed for their recovery. I also refer people to Section 8 for housing subsidies or food pantries or homeless shelters. And so with informational power, this is the responsibility for you to understand the resources that exist within our community and to refer your client population to the needed resources. So informational power is very important, particularly depending on the kinds of group members that you're working with. Connection power, close professional relationships outside of the group. This is very important, especially when you work in an agency where there are multiple treatment providers. So for example, if you're working in a one-stop shop where you're working with you might be working with social workers or employment counselors, so you might be working as a mental health treatment provider. However, there's also vocational rehabilitation. There might be court-appointed parole officers. And so you have connection power, which means that you have close professional relationships with others outside of the group. And so, and most often, especially depending on the kinds of populations you're working with, there is a lot of collaboration that exists across professional agencies. And that's one of the ways of ensuring that our clients are receiving the services that they need. So it's important to recognize that connection power is a part of what we do. It's really, really important because we never function in a vacuum. And as such, we have to make sure that we provide the necessary information to other group members. There are a number of leadership styles. And for the purpose of understanding effective group leaders, I'd like for us to talk about some of the leadership styles that are most often seen and those that are most efficacious in working in group settings. And so the three of particular interest is authoritarian, democratic, also sometimes known as an authoritative style, and also there's a laissez-faire style of leadership. So what is an authoritarian leadership style? So Lewin is someone who has done a lot of research regarding the different kinds of leadership styles and what is most effective. So Lewin identified the authoritarian leadership style as the classic style of leadership. And what happens with this authoritarian leadership style, this person holds expert position. They are typically one who directs the group's involvement. They control most facets of the group process. There's a little self-disclosing by the group leader. They avoid being personally vulnerable. Members are compliant but resent the group leader. And they're also referred to as a Theory X leader. So when you consider this kind of leader and you think about their ability to be effective, one of the things that is apparent to me is their ability to formulate a relationship with the group members. And we've already discussed previously that the relationship is the cornerstone to affect the effectiveness of a group process. So if you have a leader who is the quote unquote expert, they have all of the knowledge and information needed regarding the particular group members or their particular diagnosis or whatever the issue is that brings them to the group process. However, they are removed personally from the process. They're present physically, but not emotionally present. I see this kind of leadership as being void of many of Rogers' characteristics of a person-centered leader, where you're genuine, you have unconditional positive regard, you have empathy. I see this expert as pretty much going through the motions of what a leader is. And I would also believe that this leader is less effective because members might comply, however, they will resent the leader. I know when you have a good relationship with your members of the group, you are far more likely to get them to do things that are most important to the group process and to evolving. You're better able to get them to take risks, to step outside of their comfort zone, to open up and disclose. With this particular kind of group leader, probably the only information that the participants will share is what is absolutely necessary. In most often cases, the participants are very guarded and they're not as trusting. Disclosing is important as a group leader. However, when you disclose or you're deciding whether or not you should disclose, you should only disclose that information to your participants that is most relevant to helping them in their evolutionary process of the group. And so with an authoritarian kind of group leader, there is very little, if any, self-disclosure. Another classic form of group leader is the democratic group leader or the authoritative group leader. And with an authoritative group leader, the person is more democratic in their style. They're more group or person-centered. So a lot of what Rogers espouses from more of the humanistic perspective is what is focused or present with a democratic or authoritative group leader. So the person places responsibility on each group participant. They implicitly trust their members' ability to actively engage, participate and move through the group process. They're more likely to be Rogerian or humanistic. They're accessible and self-disclosing. Members are motivated. There is a collaborative style of leadership, and group members take responsibility. This type of group leader is referred to as a theory Y leader. And for me, I always think of the theory X and the theory Y leader as I see the theory Y as a yes or a positive leader, and I see a theory X as like a no, or the kind of leader that is less effective or not as effective in getting or impacting change. So I am definitely more of a democratic leader or an authoritative leader. I definitely am person-centered. I definitely utilize all of Rogers' essential ingredients for an effective group process. I'm very humanistic. I do self-disclose to the extent that it's relevant for the group. I am accessible to my group leaders. At times, I meet with them after the group to further help them to understand critical issues that they might be having problems identifying with. And I also believe that it's important that the group members serve to motivate, encourage, and move the group process. So I allow the group members to take responsibility for their evolution in the group process. A laissez-faire group leader is the kind of group leader that has no structure or direction in the group process. So they just allow the group leaders to do whatever they want. They pretty much attend, but they fall back and allow the group members to take the group and run with it. Members are responsible for any beneficial aspects of the group process. The group leader avoids any decision making. They accomplish very little. Members are usually confused and frustrated, and they are referred to as a theory Z, or I think of the Z as lazy or laissez-faire kind of leader. So that's what the Z represents for me. But typically, these kinds of groups are helter-skelter, free-flowing, not very little, if any, structure, and the benefit is minuscule. So as a skeleton, it might appear to be a group, but when you peel back the layers, you talk to the group members, you find that there's very little of any benefit, and most often than not, group members will not stay connected to the group process and may drop out of the group, or if they remain in the group, they might only do so because it's court mandated, and they must do so for the success of the group. So what I would encourage you to do is think about yourself and your leadership style, and think about what kind of attributes that make you either the authoritarian, the democratic or authoritative, or the laissez-faire leader. And if you find that you might be laissez-faire in terms of your personality or authoritarian, figure out ways that you can become more of a democratic leader, because it's more of a democratic leader where you would be most effective. Probably years ago, maybe back in the 50s and 60s, where, clients came to us and they expected us to be the expert and they did everything we said. Maybe back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, people were more apt to gravitate to authoritarian leader. But now in today's times, consumers prefer more of a democratic leader, because the people with whom we serve are more consumer oriented. And when people are consumer oriented, they definitely want to feel that they have a major role in the process, and that there's no dictator, but that they are given the ability to take responsibility, to have input, to receive the structure, the guidance, but they have a leader that is accessible and personable. So think about who you are, and if you feel that you might fall short in any particular way, then I encourage you to use this as an opportunity not only to be reflective, but figure out ways in which you can positively impact your leadership style to be most effective. Within the group process, it's also influenced by your interpersonal as well as intrapersonal style of leadership. And so when I speak of your interpersonal style, it's important to have an understanding of interpersonal interactions among group members and relationships that develop within the group. So you are paying attention to the dynamics of the group members. You're paying attention to the ways in which they interact. You look at the nature of the group, the quality of the group process. So as a group leader, we are paying attention to not only what's happening among our group members, or the dynamics that exist within the group members, the quality of the relationships and how the relationships will evolve over time. And we'll be talking about some of the ways in which relationships within the group evolve from the first group from the middle until the end of the group. So we'll definitely talk about that. But as a leader, we have to definitely pay attention to the interpersonal style of the group members and the interactions that exist among the members as their relationship evolves over time. In addition to that, we want to focus on the intrapersonal style, which has to do with how the members are impacted personally. So we explore why members make certain kinds of responses. So you look at what's going on with the particular individual. So it's not so much the interpersonal or the relationships that exist between members, it's what's happening within the individual, within each member, how they're feeling, what kinds of affect they're presenting, how they are responding to some of the information that's being discussed and disclosed. So you want to pay attention to not only the relationships, but the individual and how the individual is being impacted. So you focus on the individual members and their conflicts, concerns, and the individual dynamics. You also pay attention to the individual counseling within the group context. So how is each person being impacted individually? So membership roles in group is very important. So as a group leader, you want to pay attention to the different kinds of membership roles that play out within the group context. So the first is a facilitative role. So as an effective group leader, you are a facilitator, so you play a facilitative role within the process. And so you want to keep the group on task. You want to help the group members to focus on the task at hand. Sometimes I find that group members go on a tangent, and so they might start talking about different kinds of issues that might have happened to them personally or within their family. And so I allow a certain level of members to deviate, because I think when you allow them to deviate a little bit, you find that they become more expressive, they disclose more. But what I always make sure that I do is bring the group members back to the task at hand, to the target population. Tell me what, like let's say for example, if they're talking about their children, and I'll say, tell me how your children might play into your reason for being in the group. How does your relationship with your children impact on substance use and abuse behavior? So then they might say, well, whenever I deal with stressful issues with my children, it causes me to relapse, or there is the potential for me to relapse. Or when I'm using, it negatively impacts what's going on with my family. So one of the roles that group leaders play is that of a facilitative role, by keeping group members on task, by helping them to always think about things based upon their primary reason for being in the group. So you're always bringing them back to the targeted topic of importance. You also want to clarify communication. So as in your facilitative role, if the clients or your group members are making certain statements, you want to clarify, tell me exactly what it means, and you want to find out whether or not that particular meaning is different for other members of the group. So always as a facilitative role, in your facilitative role as a member, you have to ask some clarifying questions to make sure you understand exactly what the client is saying. And also, when you get the clarification, not only does it help you as the group leader, it also helps the group members, and particularly the person who is communicating. I know when working with groups that are ex-offenders or substance abuse members of the group, they a lot of times use different kinds of slangs, and I am not always understanding of what they're saying. I don't always understand what they're saying when they use the slangs that they use. Sometimes I make educated guesses, but rather than make the educated guess, I sometimes say, help me to understand exactly what you mean. I heard you just use this particular term or phrase. Explain to me what exactly that means. And other members might have different understandings as well. And so that's another reason why it's important to clarify, because not everybody come from the same experience or from the same understanding of different kinds of slang terms. Vitalizing and maintenance role. As a group leader, you have to help to develop the social and emotional bonds that exist within the group members. There are times when I work with members and I see, especially when I have members that have mixed gendered groups, and sometimes there are issues that are really specific to women, even though it's a mixed gendered group. While there might be issues specific to women, and I see that there are certain women in the group that share certain kinds of issues, I always like to hear from the women. Tell me what this means from a woman's point of view. And I also like the men of the group to be able to hear from a gender that is different from them, but I also think it's important to hear from the other gender groups as it relates to particular issues as well. So I always help to develop some of the social and emotional bonds that exist within the group. And I also help to facilitate an understanding across those different gender groups. Also, you facilitate cohesion and connectedness. It's important for group members to feel a sense of cohesiveness, a sense of connectedness. When you see that within the group, people are becoming more divisive, or there's division, or you see cliques, you definitely want to break those up, because what will happen is you'll have fractions or factions as well as factions within the group. And so as a key role for an effective group leader is to help with vitalizing and maintaining the group, and in doing so you're facilitating cohesiveness and connectedness among group members. And when you see that there are blockages to cohesiveness and connectedness, you definitely want to facilitate ways of minimizing those blocks. And that's consistent with the next bullet that talks about anti-group roles, anti-blocking. So you want to remove issues that might block relationships. And so what I've seen sometimes when group members have opposing perspectives, that's oftentimes when I see the divisiveness and the splintering of groups. So what I always do as an effective group leader with in my anti-blocking role is to help them to see perspectives of each other. So I'll say, well, you know what, Jeremy, I can see your point of view. You're saying XYZ, but I can also see Jessica's perspective when she says, whatever she says. So neither of you are wrong, you're both right. But what I think would be really great is if you can understand the points of views from each other, because both of you share a perspective that is valid. So I think one of the creative ways of anti-group blocking is to help them to take on each other's points of view, to see things from each other's vantage points, rather than being stuck in their own perspectives, to maybe see what each other's points of views are. And when you help your group members to take on each other's perspectives and points of view, then you're more likely to have cohesiveness and connectiveness rather than divisiveness and splintering that can occur in groups. There are times within the group context you may have difficult group members. So you might have a group member who speaks for everyone in the group. And whenever they do that, I always say, well, Jason, I understand that might be your point of view, but perhaps other members of the group might have other points of view. And so I might ask other members of the group, what do you think about what Jason just said? How does that differ from you? How is it similar to what the person just said? Um, and then sometimes you have persons in the group, especially verbose members of the group, they want to speak for other people. They want to be the other person's voice. And I'll say, you know what, I appreciate what you just said, but I'd like to hear the voice of Jessica. I want to hear Jessica, how Jessica would respond to that particular question or comment that was raised. So you don't want any group members to speak for everyone or for another person. And so I always try and handle it carefully because I don't want to shut anybody down, but I definitely want to promote people speaking for themselves and having alternative points of views. And sometimes you have group members that are entitled. They behave in ways that come across as being entitled. And I know when I work with persons that have a history of drug use, ex-offenders, or drug dealers, a lot of times, or people that were formerly, drug dealers or formerly substance abusers, formerly imprisoned. A lot of times there are attitudes of entitlement. I deserve, I should have, I ought to be able to. I deserve better than a job making $7.50 an hour. I deserve a job better than working at McDonald's. And so whenever you have members in your group that have a sense of entitlement, that believe that they deserve more, then it's always important to have a reality check. So tell me why you believe you deserve better than a job making minimum wages. Tell me why McDonald's is below you and you deserve a job working in an office somewhere. Help me to understand why you're too good to go to this particular job placement setting. And what always is ideal is when other members of the group will call each other on attitudes of entitlement or statements that they say that convey a sense of entitlement. Because I find when I'm always the one having to do it, sometimes it might, I think for the group members, it's like Dr. Price as the expert leader that has to put everybody in check, and it removes the responsibility from other group members. So I might give voice to attitudes of entitlement, but I'm always trying to get other group members to give alternative points of view. And I think that's the essence of being an effective group leader. You don't have to do all the work yourself. If you're skilled at being a group leader, you can help your group members to discuss and identify issues that some members might be a little bit stuck on. Sometimes you have group members that remain silent. They are in the group, they're at the group, but they're not a part of the group. So, and you especially find this when your groups are too large. So we'll talk about the fact that the ideal size of a group is 8 to 10. And when your group is smaller, you have a better ability to ensure that every group member is participating. And so when you find that group members are silent, for me, I always say, Jessica, I don't hear your voice. I really would love to hear what your thoughts are about this subject. Tell me what we've discussed that relate to what you've gone through. So when you find that there are group members that are not participating, you always want to figure out ways of getting them involved. So you'll say, Jimmy, I haven't heard your perspective. Tell me what you think. And oftentimes they'll say, well, you know what, I don't think about what. I wasn't paying attention, because they might be off somewhere else. And so that's another reason why it's good to make sure that they're involved and engaged, because otherwise they will be physically present, but mentally they will be somewhere else. And as an effective group leader, you have to be paying attention to whether people are participating or whether they're zoning out, whether they are just going through the motions. So As an effective group leader, you want to pay attention to the members of the group and whether they're silent. You also want to pay attention to whether somebody is being the scapegoat of the group, because if they're the scapegoat, then that means the focus is on one person and everyone else is not getting the treatment needed. Now, I do recognize that if a group member comes in and they have gone through something that was really traumatic, then they might need the ability to have more of the group time to focus on that particular traumatic issue. But it's always important that while you're giving a lot of the attention to one individual, you want to pay attention to the other group members, and you want to say, how was that for you? What did you feel as you were hearing Frank talk about certain issues, or as he was expressing emotions? What was that like for you? So you always want to bring your other members into the discussion, and you don't want to leave anyone out. You don't want to put the magnifying glass on any one individual without bringing other people into the discussion as it relates to their own personal issues or concerns or feelings or frustrations as well. Additional kinds of group members that are sometimes difficult are those that might challenge the leader's authority. There are sometimes group members that might say, well, how do you know what it's like? You've never been in prison before. Your life has been perfect. How do you know what it's like to be recovering from an addiction? You've never had an addiction before. And so sometimes you have to take the time to help the members to understand that while I may not have walked in your shoes, I am empathic. I can put myself in your position and identify and have an understanding of what it might be like. You don't have to have had heart surgery in order to for a heart surgeon to do heart surgery, and so you're helping the person understand that while you may not have had certain life experiences, you definitely can be and are effective. And I also let members know that, I know in my position as the leader, as the group leader, I will not positively impact on the lives of everyone. But I know that there are persons that are benefiting from what is being discussed. So when I have members that challenge my authority, I always find it necessary, especially with the groups that I have had the opportunity to work with, I always take the opportunity to address the challenge, because I find that if I don't address the challenge, then it can diminish my capacity to be an effective leader. I don't do it always in a defensive way or in an argumentative way. And there are times when I am argumentative with the group leaders, depending on how strong they come across. Because like I said, I've worked with persons who are ex-offenders or persons who are in recovery, and sometimes they are intimidating. They try to intimidate you as a group leader. And so if you're easily intimidated, then they'll steamroll over you. And so because of it, I have to, be able to have a strong constitution when I stand up to them, and when I speak unequivocally to them about some of the issues or ways in which they are challenging my authority, especially because I take my leadership responsibilities very, I feel them to be very important. I take them, I don't skirt away from my responsibilities. And so when I find members of the group that are challenging my authority as a leader, or my ability to be an effective group leader, that's what I take issue with. So it's not so much my leadership authority, but it's my effectiveness my ability to be an effective leader that I take issue with when I have group members that are challenging me in a group. There are times when you have a group member who focus on persons and conditions or events outside of the group to seek approval of the group leader or members. And so it's always important that you bring them back to the task at hand or the focus of the particular group. You have group members who might say, I don't want to hurt her feelings, so I won't say what I'd like to say. And so it's always important to help people to find constructive ways of giving feedback or asking questions without hurting other people. And I think this is where you're teaching your members of the group how to say things that they feel or think without being hurtful. So they may not know how to convey their thoughts and feelings in ways that are not hurtful, but your role and function as a group leader is to help them figure out ways of asking critical questions or saying things, giving constructive feedback to each other, but in ways that are not demeaning and hurtful. So you might have members who suggest that his or her problems are someone else's fault. So there's the blame game, blaming other people. I wouldn't be where I am if somebody hadn't snitched on me, or if my life was perfect, I wouldn't be where I am. So they blame their circumstances on others. And so it's important to use effective confrontational skills to help people to understand why they are where they are. Usually, especially in recovery, you have people in different phases of the recovery process. And so they will challenge each other to not blame others, but to accept responsibility. Because to continue to blame others and not accept responsibility is a sign that they are not actively engaged in the recovery process. Additionally, there are times when a group member will say, I've always been this way, I'm not going to change. And so you have to help members to realize that because they have always been a particular way doesn't mean that they have to continue to be that way. And so giving people an opportunity to find effective and creative ways of doing things differently is one of the most important things about the group process. I'll wait and I'll change. I'll wait and it'll change. So allowing time to be the change agent rather than the individual to be the change agent is another issue that is really detrimental when you have persons in the group that believe that they don't want to bring about the change that they seek. They want change to come by waiting, and you want to give your members the courage and the ability to change rather than to let the circumstances change. And sometimes you want to help the clients to see discrepant behavior. So you might have a client who's saying, I want a job, I want to get a job, I really want a job, but yet they're not doing anything. They're sleeping until 10 or 11. They're not doing what they're supposed to do, but yet they're saying with their words they want one thing, but their behavior is discrepant. And so sometimes you have to help your group members to see that their behaviors are not matching with their words. And so their walk and their talk and their behavior has to be consistent. And so you might help members to understand the discrepancy that exists between what they're saying and what they're doing. And then sometimes you have group members that like to talk, they just ramble. And so as an effective leader, you have to help them to say what they have to say, but not utilize an extended amount of time. Or you have to make them, tell me in 2 sentences what your major concern is. And so, or you have to be able to curtail the rambling. And so you have to have the ability to interject, interrupt, or even to refocus the client. You have members who cry, members who become angry. And so when you have members that show strong emotions, then it's your responsibility to work with those members to express their emotions constructively, recognizing that emotions are critical, but beyond the emotions, one will have to take responsibility for his or her behavior. So thus far, I've talked with you about a lot of very important information regarding being an effective leader. I hope that you have found this information useful and beneficial. I challenge you to think about this information carefully. Ask yourself various questions that you believe to be most important to challenge yourself to grow in your leadership capacity, and you will recognize that by incorporating much of what we have talked about in your leadership style and in your ability to work with groups, it will make the work that you do with groups far more easier. So thank you for your time and attention regarding what makes an effective leader, and I hope that you find it beneficial and useful in your work with groups. Thank you for your attention.